You're listening to the Alpha's Love Stories, romantic audiobooks that will make your heart race. Don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting love tales. The grand ballroom of the Onyx Fortress was a symphony of whispered power and glittering deceit. For Elara, every note was a discordant scream. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and werewolf musk, choked her. She stood frozen by a pillar of obsidian, her simple silver gown a stark contrast to the opulent dresses that swirled around her, a ghost at a feast celebrating a life she never wanted. Across the cavernous room, his gaze was a brand upon her skin, Corbin, her chosen mate. The bond, a cruel trick of fate and her family's ambition, felt less like a connection and more like a leash. His eyes, the color of cold slate, promised not love but ownership. A future of silenced opinions and suppressed spirits stretched before her, a gilded cage whose door was about to slam shut. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a bone cage. She couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to be closing in, the laughter of the nobles morphing into mocking jeers. She had to get away. But where? To run was to invite a chase. To submit was a fate worse than death. Her wild, desperate gaze swept the room, searching for an escape, any escape, and landed upon the one creature in the entire kingdom more dangerous than the male who claimed her. The Alpha King, Theron, sat upon his throne of polished jet and wolfbone. He was the still, dark center of the storm, a man carved from shadow and winter. He lounged with an air of bored indifference, a crystal goblet of blood-red wine held loosely in his hand, but his eyes were alive. They were the color of molten mercury, sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. They were the eyes of a predator who knew he was the apex of this entire forest. To approach him was insanity. To touch him was a death wish. But in that moment, for Elara, he represented the only possible sanctuary. He was the cliff edge, and she was ready to jump. Gathering the shattered pieces of her courage, she moved. She didn't walk, she glided, a silver specter cutting through the sea of color. The music seemed to falter. Conversations died mid-sentence. A path cleared before her not out of respect, but out of sheer, stunned disbelief. She kept her storm-gray eyes locked on his, seeing a flicker of surprise in their mercury depths before his expression smoothed back into an unreadable mask. She reached the dais, the cold emanating from the obsidian steps seeping through her thin slippers. Ignoring the guards who tensed, their hands going to the hilts of their swords, she climbed the 3 steps until she stood directly before the most powerful werewolf alive. Then, without a word of explanation or a plea for mercy, she turned her back on the entire staring court, on Corbin's rapidly purpling face, and sat down on the Alpha King's lap. The collective gasp that echoed through the hall was louder than any drum. The warmth of his body seeped into her, a shocking contrast to the cold dread that had filled her veins. He was solid, immovable, a mountain of muscle and power. She held herself rigid, every muscle tensed for the blow, for the roar of outrage, for the feel of his hands throwing her across the room. It never came. Instead, a slow, deep rumble vibrated through his chest and into hers. For a terrifying second, she thought it was a growl of fury. Then, an arm, heavy and corded with pure strength, wrapped around her waist. It wasn't a harsh grip, but it was unequivocal. It pulled her back, settling her more firmly against him, until her spine was molded to the hard plane of his chest. The act was so possessive, so intimate, it stole the air from her lungs. He had not rejected her audacious claim, he had accepted it. She felt him shift his head, his breath a warm caress against her ear as he spoke, his voice a low, intimate murmur meant for her alone. "Look at him," Theron commanded softly. "Let him see that his claim is now dust." Trembling, Elara forced her gaze across the ballroom. Corbin was stalking toward the dais, his face a contorted mask of rage and humiliation. "Your Majesty," he snarled, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. He pointed a trembling finger at Elara. "That female, she is my chosen mate. This is an insult to my family's honor." Theron didn't even glance his way. His mercury eyes remained fixed on Elara's profile, his presence a shield around her. "Is that so?" The king's voice was deceptively quiet, yet it carried to the farthest corners of the hall, dripping with icy authority. "She does not seem to think so." Corbin spluttered, taking another step forward. "I demand you release her to me. She is mine by right." Finally, Theron turned his head. The look he gave Corbin was so full of ancient, absolute power that the larger, younger wolf physically recoiled, his bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. The king's lip curled in a silent snarl, a flash of canine showing. It was a look that promised evisceration. Then, as if Corbin were nothing more than an irritating gnat, Theron turned his attention back to the woman in his arms. He leaned in, his lips so close to her ear that they brushed against her skin with every word, sending shivers down her spine. "Don't worry, little one," he whispered, the words a vow woven from steel and silk. "I won't let him touch you." In that moment, the world tilted on its axis. The desperate gamble of a terrified girl had just triggered. A cataclysm. The chain to her old life had been severed not by her own hand, but by the will of the Alpha King. And as she sat there, enveloped in his heat and his power, Elara knew, with a terrifying and thrilling certainty, that she had not escaped one cage only to find another. She had thrown herself into the dragon's den, and the dragon had decided to keep her. The silence in the throne room was absolute, heavier and more profound than any noise. Theron did not move, his arm a steady, unyielding band around Elara's waist, anchoring her to the present, to the shocking reality of what she had done and what he was doing. He could feel the fine tremors running through her body, a testament to the sheer force of will it had taken for her to make this desperate play. His wolf, a creature of instinct and ruthless calculation, which usually viewed the world through a lens of cold utility, was intrigued. This small, brave she-wolf with the scent of wild jasmine and storm-tossed fear had not just sought his protection, she had claimed it in the most public way imaginable. She had marked herself as his in the eyes of every noble, every rival, every sycophant in the kingdom. The audacity was breathtaking. He finally deigned to look at the sputtering beta, Corbin. "The female," Theron said, his voice resonating with finality, "has placed herself under my protection. Any prior claim is now null and void. You will leave my hall. You will not approach her. You will not even look in her direction. Is that understood?" The question was a formality, the command in his tone was absolute. Corbin's face was a picture of impotent fury. His fists clenched and unclenched, his jaw working. To defy the Alpha King was death. He knew it, everyone in the room knew it. With a strangled sound that was half growl, half sob, he spun on his heel and stormed out of the ballroom, the crowd parting for him as quickly as it had for Elara. The moment the great doors thudded shut, the tension in the room broke, replaced by a cacophony of whispered speculation. Theron ignored it all. His focus was on the woman in his lap. He shifted, his movement causing her to flinch minutely. "The show is over," he murmured, his voice still low, "for her alone. You can let go now." Elara seemed to crumple, the rigid strength leaving her body all at once. She sagged against him, a puppet with its strings cut. The reality of her actions was crashing down, and the weight of the king's attention was immense. Carefully, Theron stood, lifting her with him as if she weighed nothing. He set her on her feet, keeping a firm hand on her elbow when her knees buckled. Her gray eyes were wide, dazed, looking up at him with a mixture of terror and awe. "Lysander," Theron addressed his headguard, a mountain of. A man with a scar bisecting his brow. "Escort the lady to the Moonstone suite. Post a guard. She is not to be disturbed by anyone." "Yes, my king," Lysander rumbled, his expression carefully neutral. Theron released Elara's arm. "Go with him," he told her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You are safe now." She nodded mutely, allowing Lysander to lead her away, her silver dress a flicker of light in the dark grandeur of the hall. Theron watched her go, the ghost of her warmth and weight still lingering on his lap. His court was watching him, waiting for an explanation, a sign of his temper. He gave them nothing. He simply resumed his seat on the throne, picked up his discarded goblet, and took a slow sip of wine. The message was clear. The incident was closed. The king had spoken, but inside, his mind was racing. Who was she? A nobody from a minor, ambitious family, if he recalled correctly. The Sablythorn pact. He made a mental note to have his spymaster, Kale, dig into their dealings, particularly with the disgraced Beta's family. This was not just a simple matter of a rejected mating, it stank of political maneuvering. They had tried to pawn her off to strengthen their own position, and she, in a stunning act of rebellion, had set the entire game board on fire by throwing herself at the king. His wolf paced within him, restless. Ours, it insisted, the thought more a feeling than a word. It wasn't the primal, undeniable pull of a fated mate bond, he would have recognized that instantly. This was different. It was a deep, instinctual recognition of value, of courage, of a spirit that refused to be broken. She was a treasure that lesser wolves had tried to claim, and his possessive nature was fiercely aroused. She had come to him. She had chosen his protection over a life of submission. He would not be giving her back. Later, in the solitude of his private chambers, the image of her wouldn't leave him. The look in her stormy eyes as she walked toward him, a blend of sheer terror and unbreakable resolve. The feel of her, so delicate yet so strong. She had not begged. She had not cried. She had acted. In a world of sycophants and schemers, such raw, desperate courage was a rare and intoxicating thing. Theron, the Alpha King who had spent a lifetime building walls of ice around his heart, felt the first, faint crack form. He had started this as a political move, to assert his dominance and crush an upstart beta. But now, it was becoming something else entirely. The game had just become personal. The Moonstone Suite was the most beautiful prison Elara had ever seen. The rooms were spacious and airy, decorated in shades of silver, white, and pale blue. A balcony overlooked the royal gardens, and the bed was larger than her entire room back home. But the luxury couldn't disguise the truth. She was a captive of her own making. The guard, Lysander, stationed outside her door was a silent reminder that while she was safe from Corbin, she was now utterly at the mercy of the Alpha King. The first day passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Servants brought her food, which she couldn't eat, and beautiful clothes, which she couldn't bring herself to touch. They treated her with a cautious, deferential silence, their eyes full of unasked questions. She was an anomaly, a disruption. The girl who had sat on the king's lap. On the second day, the fear began to curdle into a restless anxiety. What was Theron's plan? Was she to be a temporary amusement, a pawn in a larger game, locked away until he decided her fate? The not knowing was its own special kind of torture. She paced the lush carpets, her mind racing over the events in the ballroom. The feel of his arm around her, the heat of his body, the absolute authority in his whispered promise. "I won't let him touch you." He had meant it, but what was the price for such a vow? Her answer came on the third day. The door to her suite opened without a knock, and Theron himself filled the doorway. He was not dressed in his formal royal attire but in a simple, dark tunic and trousers that did nothing to diminish his aura of power. He looked different, more approachable, yet somehow more dangerous for it. "You pace like a caged wolf," he remarked, his mercury eyes taking in her restless form. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. Elara stopped mid-pace, her heart leaping into her throat. She instinctively dropped into a curtsy, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Your Majesty, look at me," he commanded, not unkindly. She forced her gaze upward, meeting his. The intensity in his silver gaze was still unnerving, but the outright fury she had expected was absent. Instead, he looked curious, analytical. "Walk with me," he said, turning and expecting her to follow. It wasn't a request. Swallowing her trepidation, she fell into step beside him as he led her out of the suite and down a long, tapestry-lined corridor. Lysander followed at a discreet distance. "You have caused quite a stir, Elara of Sablythorn," Theron said as they walked. "My court is buzzing with theories. Some say you are a clever spy. Others, a foolish girl with a death wish. My beta, Kale, believes you are a political opportunist." Elara's cheeks heated. "And what do you believe, Your Majesty?" He stopped, turning to face her fully. They were in a secluded alcove with a large stained glass window that cast colored light on the stone floor. "I believe," he said, his eyes searching hers, "that you were desperate. Truly, soul-crushingly despair. And I have found that desperate creatures, when cornered, are capable of either great cowardice or great courage. You displayed the latter. I am impressed." His words, so unexpected, sent a shock through her system. Impressed? She had braced herself for anger, for contempt, not for praise. Why? The question was out before she could stop it. Why did you let me? You could have had me thrown out. Or executed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. You presented me with an interesting problem. A beta's son, from a family that has been growing increasingly ambitious, was claiming a female who clearly wanted no part of him. You challenged his claim in the most public way possible, by invoking my authority. To have denied you would have been to side with his ambition over your clear distress. It would have shown weakness. A king cannot afford to be weak. He paused, his gaze intense. But more than that, you intrigued me. It takes a spine of solid steel to do what you did. He began walking again, and she followed, her mind reeling. He was not the unfeeling monster she had feared. He was a strategist, a king who saw the world in moves and countermoves. And in her desperate act, he had seen an opportunity. Your family, he continued, his tone shifting, becoming harder. Tell me about this, chosen, mating. And so, as they walked through the sun-dappled halls of his fortress, Elara told him. She spoke of her father's dwindling influence, of her family's desperation to climb the social ladder. She told him of the arrangement with Corbin's family, a union that would bring her family wealth and status in exchange for her future. She spoke of Corbin's cruel nature, his possessiveness, the way he enjoyed belittling her. She held nothing back, the words pouring out of her in a torrent of long-suppressed pain and anger. She told him of the night she had overheard her father and Corbin's father discussing her like a piece of livestock, finalizing the price of her freedom. Theron listened in silence, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When she finished, they had reached a secluded walled garden, fragrant with night-blooming flowers. He stopped beside a marble fountain, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They sold you, he stated, his voice dangerously quiet. Your own blood. They sold you to that brute to buy themselves favor. Elara nodded, fresh tears stinging her eyes. She wiped them away angrily. I was a commodity, not a daughter. Theron turned to her, the moonlight catching the silver in his eyes, making them glow. The anger on his face was not directed at her, but it was terrifying nonetheless. It was the cold, focused fury of a king whose sense of justice had been profoundly offended. Then they are fools, he bit out. They valued gold and status over a treasure of far greater worth. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Understand this, Elara, what you did in that ballroom was not an act of desperation in my eyes. It was a declaration of independence. You took your fate into your own hands. You are no one's commodity. Not anymore. He reached out, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would touch her face. Instead, his hand paused in midair, then dropped back to his side. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. You are under my protection now, he said, his voice softening slightly. That means no one will ever sell you, claim you, or touch you against your will again. Not Corbin, not your family, no one. He looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her face, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the moonlit garden with his vow echoing in her ears and the first, fragile shoots of something that felt dangerously like hope beginning to grow in her heart. The cage was still there, but its bars were now made of the Alpha King's will, and for the first time, they felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. The days settled into a new, surreal rhythm. Elara was a storm contained within gilded walls. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a gnawing restlessness. She was safe, yes. But she was also a spectacle. When she walked the halls with Lysander, a silent, hulking shadow behind her, courtiers would fall silent, their eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and outright envy. Whispers slithered in her wake like serpents. The king's new pet, the upstart Omega, how long until he tires of her? She took to spending most of her time in the royal library, a cavernous room smelling of old parchment and beeswax. It was the one place where she felt she could breathe, surrounded by stories of other lives, other worlds. It was here, on the 5th day, that Theron found her again. She was perched on a ladder, reaching for a heavy tome on the history of the Northern Pax, when his voice floated up from below, making her jump. Seeking strategic advice? Elara clutched the ladder, her heart performing its now familiar frantic dance. He stood at the base, looking up at her, his expression unreadable. He was, once again, in his simple, dark clothes, a king who seemed to disdain the trappings of his own station. Merely seeking to understand the kingdom whose ruler I so brazenly accosted, she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She descended the ladder, the book in her hands a welcome shield. Theron's lips quirked. A wise pursuit. He fell into step beside her as she moved towards a reading taw. BLE. And what have you learned? That your line is ancient, and your reign has been one of unprecedented peace and prosperity, she said, placing the book on the table. It was the truth, according to the dry, scholarly texts. Peace is a fragile thing, he said, his gaze drifting to the high, stained glass windows. It is maintained not by kindness, but by strength. The moment you show weakness, the jackals begin to circle. He looked back at her, his mercury eyes sharp. You witnessed a small pack of them in my ballroom. Corbin, she stated, him, and others. His father, Beta Torvin, has been testing my boundaries for years. Your little performance provided a perfect opportunity to remind him of his place. He said it so clinically, so dispassionately, that a chill went down her spine. Had it all been a political calculation? Had her desperation merely been a convenient tool for him? She must have flinched, because his expression softened minutely. Do not mistake me, Elara. His treatment of you was an abomination. I would have dealt with it eventually. You simply forced my hand in a more dramatic fashion. He reached out and tapped the cover of the book she held. But understanding the politics of this court is as important as understanding its history. You are in the eye of the storm now. You should know what winds are swirling around you. He was warning her. He was including her. The gesture, the shared confidence, was more intimate than his arm around her waist had been. That had been a public display. This was a private offering. For instance, he continued, his voice dropping, your father arrived at the fortress this morning. The blood drained from Elara's face. The book slipped from her numb fingers and thudded onto the table. What? He demanded an audience. He is currently cooling his heels in one of the receiving rooms, no doubt rehearsing a speech full of righteous indignation about his stolen daughter. Theron watched her, his gaze analytical, assessing her reaction. What would you have me do with him? The question stunned her. He was giving her a say. He, the Alpha King, was asking her what to do with her own father. The power in that simple question was dizzying. I don't know, she whispered, her hands trembling. Then come, he said, offering his arm. Listen, observe, learn the price of betrayal. Her legs felt like water, but she forced herself to take his arm. His forearm was like forged iron beneath her fingers. Lysander fell in behind them as Theron led her not to the throne room, but to a small antechamber adjacent to it. A large, two-way mirror of polished obsidian looked into the receiving room where her father, Alpha Gideon of Sablythorn, paced like a caged animal. Seeing him here, in the heart of the king's power, he seemed smaller than she remembered. His face, usually a mask of stern authority, was pinched with anxiety and suppressed fury. Theron did not enter. He stood with Elara in the shadows of the antechamber, a silent, powerful sentinel. He nodded to a guard, who opened the door to the receiving room. Alpha Gideon, Theron's voice, amplified and echoing slightly, filled the other room through a hidden speaking tube. Elara jumped. Her father spun around, facing the empty room, his eyes wide. Your Majesty. Gideon bowed deeply, his voice obsequious. I come before you with a heavy heart. My daughter, Elara, she is a willful, foolish girl. She has clearly misunderstood a sacred arrangement between our families and caused a grave insult. I am here to collect her and offer my most profound apologies to Beta Torvin and his son. I will see her properly disciplined. Elara's nails dug into her palms. Disciplined. She knew what that meant. A private, brutal correction to ensure her compliance. Theron's expression was glacial. There has been no misunderstanding, Gideon, his disembodied voice stated. The female, Elara, has formally and publicly rejected the claim of Corbin. She has invoked my protection. The matter is closed. Gideon's face flushed. Your Majesty, with all due respect, she is my daughter. She is a member of my pack. Her actions are my responsibility. This whimsical protection cannot override pack law and a father's right. Can it not? Theron's voice was soft, deadly. I am the law, Gideon, and I have looked into the terms of this sacred arrangement. It seems your daughter was the currency for a significant transfer of land and silver from Beta Torvin to you. You did not secure a mate for your child, you sold her. Tell me, does pack law condone the selling of females into a mating they fear and despise? Gideon sputtered, his confidence crumbling. It was a strategic alliance. For the good of the pack. For the good of your own status, Theron corrected, his voice like a whip crack. You valued a piece of land and a chest of silver over the well-being of your own blood. You were not a father seeking his daughter. You were a merchant who has had his merchandise confiscated. And you have the audacity to come into my house and demand its return? The silence in the receiving room was absolute. Gideon stood, defeated and exposed, his shoulders slumping. The alliance with Torvin is dissolved, Theron declared. The land and silver you received are forfeit to the crown. You will return to Sablythorn. You will never again attempt to contact Elara. You will never again barter with your children. If you do, I will not strip you of your title. I will strip you of your head. Do you understand? And Gideon could only nod, a broken man. Dismissed. The guard opened the door, and Gideon shuffled out, his spirit shattered. In the antechamber, Elara was trembling, her breath coming in short gasps. She had just witnessed the absolute power of the king, wielded with chilling precision and utter finality. He had dismantled her father, destroyed the alliance that had been her prison, and secured her freedom, all without raising his voice or his hand. Theron turned to her. The cold fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. The jackal has been sent back to his den with his tail between his legs, he said softly. Tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. They were not tears of sadness for her father, but of overwhelming, soul-deep relief. The last chain had been broken. She was free. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Theron's waist, burying her face in his chest. "Thank you," she sobbed, her words muffled by his tunic. "Thank you." For a moment, he stood perfectly still, rigid with surprise. Then, slowly, his arms came up to encircle her. One hand came to rest on her back, the other cradled the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. It was not the possessive hold of the throne room, but something infinitely more gentle. Protective. "You are safe, Elara," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low, soothing vibration against her ear. "I told you I would not let him touch you. I meant your father as well." He held her until her tears subsided, until the tremors running through her body stilled. And in the dark, quiet safety of his embrace, with the scent of sandalwood and cold night air clinging to him, Elara felt the first, undeniable shift in the fortress she had built around her own heart. A crack had appeared, and through it, a terrifying, exhilarating warmth began to seep in. The king was not just her protector. He was becoming her sanctuary. The aftermath of her father's humiliation settled over Elara like a strange, quiet calm. The fortress, which had felt like a gilded cage, now began to feel like a true sanctuary. The whispers in the halls didn't cease, but they changed in tone. The pity and envy were now tinged with a new, wary respect. The king had not just taken in a stray, he had gone to war for her, dismantling a beta and an alpha with a few carefully chosen words. She was no longer just the girl on his lap, she was the woman under his unequivocal protection. Theron, for his part, seemed to be everywhere. Their paths crossed with a frequency that felt beyond coincidence. He would appear in the library as she studied, offering a clarifying comment on a dense historical text. He would find her in the gardens, asking her opinion on a new species of night bee. Looming orchid his gardeners were cultivating. He never stayed long, these encounters were brief, but they were charged. He was peeling back her layers, not with the force of an alpha, but with the quiet persistence of a man genuinely intrigued. Elara found herself looking for him, her senses heightened, attuned to the sound of his footsteps, the scent of sandalwood and frost that announced his presence. Her wolf, a creature she had long suppressed, began to stir within her, not in fear, but in a low, curious hum whenever he was near. One evening, he found her on her balcony, watching the twin moons rise over the jagged peaks of the Onyx Mountains. "You are quiet tonight," he observed, leaning against the balcony rail beside her. The moonlight silvered his dark hair and cast his sharp features in stark relief. "I was thinking about the price of freedom," she said softly, not looking at him. "My father paid with his pride and his ambition. Corbin paid with his future. What is my price, Your Majesty?" He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant howl of a lone wolf on the mountain. "I told you," he said, his voice low. "You are not a commodity. There is no price." "Everything has a price," she countered, finally turning to face him. "Even kindness. Especially from a king." His mercury eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Then consider it an investment." "In what?" "In you." The simplicity of his answer stole her breath. "I have ruled for a long time, Elara. I am surrounded by those who want something from me, power, favor, wealth. You asked for nothing but sanctuary. You looked at the most powerful wolf in the kingdom and saw not a means to an end, but a refuge. That is a rare thing. It is a thing worth protecting. Worth investing in." He wasn't looking at her as a king looks at a subject. He was looking at her as a man looks at a woman who has utterly captivated him. The air between them grew thick, humming with an unspoken tension that was as terrifying as it was thrilling. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. Before she could form a response, a commotion from the courtyard below shattered the moment. Shouts, the clang of steel. Lysander burst onto the balcony, his face grim. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice tight. "Intruders." In the lower vaults, Theron's posture changed instantly. The contemplative man was gone, replaced by the warlord king. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a flinty coldness. How many? A small group, highly skilled. They bypassed the outer guards. Lysander's gaze flickered to Elara. Their trajectory suggests they were heading for the royal residences. Theron's head snapped towards Elara, his eyes sweeping over her as if assuring himself of her soffit. Why? The possessiveness in that look was a physical force. Lock down the fortress. No one in or out, Theron commanded, his voice like cracking ice. Lysander, you will remain here. Guard her with your life. If any threat comes near this door, you are to eliminate it without question. Yes, my king. Theron turned back to Elara. The intensity in his gaze was staggering. Do not leave this room. Do not open this door for anyone but me or Lysander. It was the same command he had given in the garden, but now it was layered with a new, raw fear. Not for his fortress, but for her. He didn't wait for her acknowledgement. He was a blur of motion, striding from the room, his power flaring around him like a dark corona. The door shut with a definitive thud, leaving Elara alone with the stoic Lysander, the romantic tension of moments before now twisted into a knot of cold, sharp fear. The jackals weren't just circling, they had broken into the den. The moments stretched into an hour, each one an eternity. Elara paced the sitting room of her suite, her ears straining for any sound beyond the door. Lysander stood like a statue, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his entire being focused on the threshold. The silence from the rest of the fortress was more frightening than any noise. It was the silence of a predator hunting. Then, they heard it. The sound of fighting, muffled shouts, the distinct ring of steel on steel, coming from the corridor outside. It was moving closer. Lysander drew his sword, the sound a soft whisper of lethal intent. He positioned himself directly in front of the door, a mountain of a man ready to become an immovable wall. Stay behind me, my lady, he murmured, his voice low and steady. Elara's heart was in her throat. She looked around frantically for a weapon, her hand closing around a heavy, silver candlestick from the mantelpiece. It was pitiful, but it was something. The fighting outside the door reached a crescendo. A pained cry was cut short. Then, a heavy thud against the door itself, making the thick wood shudder. Silence. Then, a knock. 3 sharp, precise raps. Lysander didn't move. Identify yourself, he barked. A low, pained chuckle came from the other side. It's Kale, you oaf. Open the door. The threat is neutralized. Elara recognized the voice of the king's spymaster, a man with eyes that saw everything and a smile that promised nothing. Lysander hesitated for a fraction of a second, then, keeping his sword raised, he unlocked and opened the door a crack. Kale stood there, leaning against the doorframe. His clothes were disheveled, and a thin trail of blood dripped from a cut on his temple. Behind him, 2 royal guards were checking the bodies of 3 black-clad figures lying motionless on the RBLE floor. The king? Lysander asked, his voice tight. Unharmed. He's cleaning up the last of them in the east wing, Kale said, his sharp eyes scanning the room and landing on Elara, still clutching her candlestick. A faint, approving smile touched his lips. It seems the lady has a fighter's spirit. Good. Just then, Theron appeared at the end of the corridor. He was breathing heavily, his tunic splattered with blood that was not his own. In his hand, he held a wickedly curved dagger, its blade dark and sticky. His power rolled off him in waves, a palpable force of fury and relief. His silver eyes, burning with a feral light, immediately found Elara, scanning her from head to toe, ensuring she was unharmed. He strode towards them, dismissing Kale and the guards with a curt nod. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Elara, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the coppery tang of blood and the wild, electric scent of his unleashed power. He reached out, and his fingers, stained with blood, were surprisingly gentle as they wrapped around the hand that held the candlestick. He pried it from her grip, his thumb stroking over her whitened knuckles. You were ready to fight, he stated, his voice a low, rough rumble. It wasn't a question. Elara could only nod, her voice trapped in her throat by the sheer, overwhelming force of his presence. A strange, fierce pride blazed in his eyes. He lifted his other hand and cupped her cheek, his touch searing her skin. The world narrowed to this point of contact, to the storm in his mercury gaze. The intruders, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. They were not here for the vault. They were assassins, sent for you. The air left her lungs. For her? Why? Torvin and your father, Theron clarified, his jaw tightening. A final, desperate play. They thought to remove the problem and blame it on the chaos of a vault robbery. Rage, cold and sharp, cut through her fear. They hadn't just sold her, they had now tried to have her killed. Theron's thumb stroked her cheekbone, a soothing contrast to the fury in his eyes. They have failed, and they have signed their own death warrants with this act. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers. His next words were a vow, sealed in blood and fire. No one will ever harm you, Elara. I will burn their packs to the ground and salt the earth before I let them touch a single hair on your head. You are mine to protect. The word, mine, hung in the air between them, no longer just a statement of possession, but a declaration of something deeper, something primal and absolute. In the aftermath of violence, surrounded by the evidence of his lethal power and his fierce, terrifying protectiveness, Elara didn't feel fear. She felt a shocking, profound sense of belonging. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his on her cheek. The jackals had struck, and in doing so, they had only succeeded in forging the bond between the king and his unexpected Luna into unbreakable steel. The game had escalated to a war, and Elara was no longer just a pawn in it. She was the prize, and the king was ready to lay waste to entire kingdoms to keep her. The fortress did not sleep that night. It hummed with a low, vengeful energy. Torches burned brighter, guards patrolled in tighter formations, and the air itself tasted of iron and grim purpose. Theron had withdrawn into his war room with Kale and his most trusted commanders, the maps before them no longer tools of administration but blueprints for retribution. Elara, however, was not relegated to the role of a frightened bystander. Theron had given a new command. She was to be included in the briefings. When Lysander had conveyed this, his own surprise was poorly concealed. No Omega, no female not born of a war general line, had ever been permitted in the inner sanctum of the King's War Council. She entered the room, feeling the weight of the commander's stares. They were hardened warriors, scarred and skeptical. But a single, sharp glance from Theron silenced any potential objection. He pulled out a chair for her at his right hand, a silent, powerful statement that reverberated through the room more loudly than any proclamation. The assassins were from the Shadowfang clan, Kale began, pointing a slender dagger to a region on the map bordering Torvin's lands. Mercenaries. Deniable. But the payment trail, while hidden, leads back to a joint account controlled by Torvin and your father, Gideon. Theron's hand, resting on the table, curled into a fist. They outsourced her death, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. They did not even have the courage to send their own wolves. They sought to maintain the facade of innocence. One of the older commanders, a grizzled wolf named Rorik, grunted. A clumsy attempt. Clumsy or not, it was an act of war, Theron stated, his gaze sweeping the room. Against the crown. Against me. His eyes settled on Elara. What is your counsel? The room went utterly still. Every eye was on her. They expected her to plead for mercy, to be the soft, forgiving heart. She felt the expectation like a physical pressure. But the girl who had pleaded was gone, burned away by the fire of attempted murder. She met Theron's gaze, her storm-gray eyes clear and hard. Mercy would be seen as weakness, she said, her voice steady, though her heart thundered. It would invite further challenges. Not just against me, but against your authority. You cannot show tea. He jackals your throat after they have already tried to bite. A slow, approving smile touched Kale's lips. Rorik gave a grudging nod. Theron's expression was unreadable, but a fierce pride burned in his eyes. And what would you have me do? Make an example, Elara said, the words tasting like cold justice. But a precise one. Do not wage a war that will cost the lives of countless warriors who are only following orders. The guilt lies with the heads of the snakes. Cut them off. Theron held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. He saw not a vengeful girl, but a queen in the making, one who understood the brutal calculus of power. He turned back to his commanders. You heard your Luna, he said, and the title, used so casually and so definitively, sent a shockwave through the room. We do not march on their packs. We issue a formal challenge. A duel of honor. I will face Torvin and Gideon myself. Protests erupted immediately. Your Majesty, it is too great a risk. Let me fight in your stead. Theron silenced them with a raised hand. They conspired to kill what is mine, he said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. This is not a matter for proxies. This is personal. The challenge will be issued at dawn. As the commanders filed out to make preparations, Theron remained, his eyes on the map but his focus entirely on Elara. You surprise me, he murmured. You asked for my counsel. I did. I did not expect you to counsel blood. Elara stood, walking to the window that overlooked the training grounds below. They sold me. Then they tried to murder me. The girl who believed in mercy died with the assassins at my door. She turned to face him. You told me I was an investment. Investments must be protected. Sometimes, that protection requires a sharp blade. He crossed the room until he was standing before her, the space between them crackling with the intensity of their shared resolve. He didn't touch her, but his gaze was a physical caress. When this is over, he said, his voice a low promise, there will be no more shadows. No more threats. You will be able to walk in the sun without looking over your shoulder. And what will I be then, Theron? She asked, daring to use his name for the first time. The king's protected investment, or something else? A ghost of a smile, dark and possessive, touched his lips. You will be what you were always meant to be. Mine. He left her then, to prepare for his duel, leaving her with the echo of that single, devastating word. Mine. It was no longer a threat or a claim of ownership. It was a vow, a destiny, and as Elara looked out at the gathering dawn, she knew with a terrifying certainty that she wanted nothing more in the world than to belong to him. The challenge circle, an ancient ring of standing stones within the fortress walls, was packed with every noble, warrior, and servant who could find a space. The air was thick with anticipation and the scent of rain. The sky above was a leaden gray, mirroring the grim occasion. Elara stood at the front of the royal pavilion, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was dressed not in silks, but in a simple, dark gray dress, the color of resolve. Lysander stood beside her, a silent pillar of strength. First, her father, Gideon, entered the circle. He looked old and shrunken, his eyes darting around nervously. He had not wanted this fight, he had been dragged into it by Torvin's ambition and his own greed. Then came Beta Torvin, a bull of a man, his face a mask of arrogant fury. He believed his years of battle experience would give him an edge against the younger king. Finally, Theron arrived. He walked into the circle with the casual grace of a predator entering its natural domain. He wore no armor, only his dark tunic and trousers. He carried no sword. He was the weapon. His power radiated from him, a silent storm that made the very air hum. His silver eyes swept the crowd, and when they found Elara, they lingered for a heartbeat, a silent message passing between them. Watch me. Trust me. The head elder announced the terms, a fight to the death. The crimes of treason and attempted assassination were read aloud, drawing gasps from the crowd. The formalities concluded. The circle was sealed. Torvin shifted first, his body contorting into a massive, brindled wolf with saliva dripping from his fangs. Gideon followed suit, his wolf form smaller, grayer, already cowed. Theron did not shift. He stood, calm and immovable, as the two wolves began to circle him. With a coordinated snarl, they attacked. It was not a fight, it was an execution. Theron moved with a speed that defied sight. He sidestepped Gideon's lunge, grabbing the smaller wolf by the scruff of the neck and, with a sickening crack, breaking it. He dropped the lifeless body before it even hit the ground, his eyes never leaving Torvin. Elara watched, her hand flying to her mouth. Her father was gone. The man who had sold her, who had tried to have her killed, was dead. She felt a hollow ache, not of grief, but of a final, terrible severance. Torvin, enraged and terrified, charged. Theron met him head-on. He didn't dodge. He slammed his fist into the wolf's snout, the impact echoing like a thunderclap. Bone crunched. Torvin yelped, stumbling back. Theron was on him in an instant, his hands closing around the beast's throat. This is for daring to touch what is mine, Theron growled, his voice the only sound in the stunned silence. With a final, brutal twist, he ended it. He oohed over the two bodies, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. The rain began to fall, a soft, cleansing drizzle that washed the blood from the stones and from his hands. He turned, his gaze finding Elara once more. The crowd was silent, awed and terrified by the display of raw, absolute power. Theron walked towards the pavilion, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't look at the nobles, at the commanders. He looked only at her. He stopped before her, the scent of blood and rain clinging to him. He reached out, his fingers, still wet with the rain and the evidence of his vengeance, gently cupped her chin. It is done, he said, his voice rough with spent adrenaline. The past is buried. Your future begins now. And in his eyes, she saw it. Not just a king who had defended his claim, but a man who had fought for her. The last of her fears melted away, washed clean by the rain and the ferocity of his protection. The embers of war had burned away the last of her old life, and from the ashes, something new and powerful was rising. She was his, and he was hers, and the entire kingdom now knew it. The silence in the great hall was a living thing, thick with anticipation. The morning sun streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like gold dust in the air. The scars of the recent duel had been scrubbed from the challenge circle, but the memory of Theron's absolute power was fresh in every mind. Elara stood at the center of it all, but the feeling was entirely different from the terrified girl who had walked this path weeks before. Then, she had been a solitary figure moving through a hostile sea. Now, she was the calm eye of a storm of adoration and curiosity. She was flanked by Theron's most trusted guards, and at her side, a solid, unshakable presence, was the king himself. He was resplendent in his formal regalia, a tunic of black velvet embroidered with threads of obsidian that caught the light, and over it, a cloak of winter wolf pelts, stark and white. The crown of jet and sharpened wolf bone sat upon his brow, a symbol of deadly authority. But his hand, which held hers, was gentle, his thumb stroking slow, reassuring circles on her skin. Her own gown was a masterpiece. The deep sapphire of the fabric seemed to hold the very essence of the night sky, while the silver embroidery was so intricate it looked as though the constellations themselves had been plucked from the heavens and stitched into the cloth. On her brow, she would soon wear not a heavy crown, but the luna's circlet, a delicate yet unbreakable band of moonstone and platinum, designed to be a partner to Theron's, not a subject. The elder, his voice amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics, began the ancient rites. He spoke of the history of Onyx Fortress, of the strength of the Alpha, and then, of the heart of the Luna. For a kingdom cannot be ruled by strength alone, he intoned, his eyes on Elara. It must be guided by compassion, nurtured by wisdom, and united by a love that sees the pack not as subjects, but as family. He lifted the circlet. Elara of Sablythorn, do you, before the moon goddess and the assembled packs, swear to uphold these truths? To lead with compassion, to defend the weak, to be a voice for the voiceless, and to stand, forever and always, as an equal pillar of strength beside your king and mate? Elara's voice did not waver. It was clear, resonant, and filled with a conviction that silenced the last of the skeptical whispers. I swear it. As the cool weight of the moonstone circlet settled on her brow, a collective sigh seemed to move through the crowd. It was done. Theron turned to her then. The formal mask of the king fell away, and what was left was a man overcome with a fierce, possessive pride and a love so profound it was almost painful to witness. He didn't bow. He didn't kiss her hand. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs brushing away the single tear of joy that escaped her eye. My Elara, he murmured, the words for her alone, though the entire hall heard. My Luna. Then he kissed her. It was not a chaste coronation kiss. It was a claiming, a promise, a sealing of their fate. It was filled with the memory of her desperate gamble, the terror of the assassins, the fury of the duel, and the breathtaking tenderness of their first night. The hall erupted into a roar of approval, but for Theron and Elara, the world had shrunk to the space between their lips. It was the end of her old life and the glorious beginning of their shared reign. The door to their private chambers closed with a soft, definitive thud, locking out the sounds of the ongoing celebration. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering light of a massive fireplace, its glow reflecting off the dark polished wood and rich tapestries. The scent of the winter blossoms from the hall mingled with the inherent aroma of sandalwood and frost that was uniquely Theron. The public confidence of the newly crowned Luna melted away, leaving a flicker of nervous anticipation. This was the sacred space, the final frontier of their new bond. Her hands, which had been so steady holding the scepter, now trembled slightly as she unpinned the circlet from her hair, setting it carefully on a velvet-lined stand beside Theron's far more formidable crown. She felt his presence behind her before he touched her. His warmth was a tangible force at her back. Elara, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. Look at me. She turned, her storm-gray eyes meeting his Lten silver. The intensity there was not demanding, but questioning, patient. He reached out, not to pull her to him, but to gently take her hands, lacing his fingers through hers. This, he said, his gaze sweeping the room, then returning to her, changes nothing that is not already written here. He brought their joined hands to his chest, pressing her palm over the steady, powerful beat of his heart. And here, his other hand rose to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her temple, his fingertips whispering against her skin. His words were a balm. He saw her nervousness and was dismantling it, piece by piece. You are my Luna, he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. You are my mate, the other half of my soul. But tonight, in this room, you are just Elara. And I am just Theron. A man who is utterly, desperately in love with his wife. The admission, so raw and sincere, shattered the last of her reservations. A soft sob escaped her, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy and relief. He closed the distance between them, his hands rising to cradle her face as if she were the most precious thing in his kingdom. His lips met hers, and this kiss was nothing like the one in the hall. That had been a declaration. This was an exploration. It was slow, deep, and achingly tender, a silent conversation of promises and devotion. He took his time. His hands were not hurried, but worshipful, tracing the line of her jaw, the column of her neck, the delicate curve of her shoulders. He peeled away the layers of her formal gown with a reverence that made her feel cherished, not possessed. His lips followed the path his hands had blazed, branding her not with ownership, but with adoration. He whispered her name against her skin like a prayer, against the pulse in her throat, the sensitive hollow of her collarbone, the swell of her breast. Each touch, each kiss, was designed to banish the ghosts of her past, to rewrite the story of her worth on her very flesh. When he finally laid her back on the furs before the fire, his body covering hers, there was no fear, only a shattering need. Their joining was not a conquest, but a culmination. A perfect, searing fusion of two broken halves made whole. It was a storm of sensation and emotion, a dizzying ascent that ended in a cry of his name on her lips and the feeling of her own tears on his cheeks. As they lay tangled together in the aftermath, breathless and sated, Elara knew with absolute certainty that she was home. The lonely Omega was gone, replaced by a queen, a mate, a woman truly, completely, and irrevocably loved. The war chamber felt different with Elara in it. The massive oak table, usually littered with maps and troop dispositions, now also held her neat scrolls of notes and careful inked charts. The air, once thick with the aggressive musk of rival generals, now carried the subtle, calming scent of jasmine that seemed to follow her. The first true test came during a council on winter provisions. Alpha Greyfang, a grizzled old wolf from the mountainous western territory whose loyalty had always been to Theron's strength rather than his person, leaned forward, his gnarled hands flat on the table. The western passes will be sealed by the next moon, he grumbled, his voice like grinding stones. My patrols need double rations now, or they'll be chewing on their own boots by midwinter. The current allotment is an insult. He glared at the quartermaster, a nervous-looking man who shrank in his seat. Theron's expression was neutral, but Elara could see the flicker of impatience in his eyes. This was an old argument. Before Theron could speak, Elara did. Her voice was calm, cutting through the tension. The current allotment is based on last year's numbers, is it not, quartermaster? The man nodded hastily. Yes, Luna. And last year, Elara continued, turning her steady gaze back to Greyfang, the western patrol consisted of 50 wolves. Your own report from last month, Alpha Greyfang, states you have increased your border guards to 70, anticipating trouble from the rogue packs in the Stone-Tooth valleys. Yet you submitted a requisition for only 55 sets of rations. Why is that? Greyfang blinked, thrown off balance. The extra men are temporary. Are they? Elara asked, a slight, knowing smile on her lips. She unrolled one of her charts. Because the Stone-Tooth rogues have been unusually active. It seems a permanent increase is not just anticipated, but necessary. However, requesting double rations for 55 men when you have 70 is either poor accounting, she paused, letting the word hang in the air, or an attempt to stockpile resources for a purpose you have not disclosed to your king. The silence in the room was absolute. Greyfang's face flushed a dark red. He had been caught, not in treason, but in greed and deception. He had hoped to use the extra resources to trade for personal gain. Elara didn't press the attack. She offered a solution. I have reviewed the grain stores and the hunting reports from the southern plains. We can allocate a 15% increase for your 70 men, Alpha Greyfang. It is not double, but it is fair, and it will see them through the winter without resorting to cannibalism. She slid the new distribution chart towards him. This also ensures the southern patrols, who face their own challenges, are not left wanting. Greyfang stared at the chart. Her numbers were impeccable, her logic unassailable. She had not just called his bluff, she had solved his actual problem while exposing his duplicity. He gave a stiff, grudging nod. The Luna is perceptive. The allocation is acceptable. Theron, who had watched the entire exchange without saying a word, finally spoke. See that it is done. His voice held a note of finality, but when he looked at Elara, his eyes held a fire that had nothing to do with the business of the kingdom and everything to do with the brilliant, formidable woman he had married. She had not needed his protection. She had wielded her own intelligence as a weapon and had won the first of many battles for her place at the table, not as a consort, but as a ruler. The peace, hard won and delicately balanced, was shattered on a crisp, cloudless night. Jax, the sole surviving son of the traitor Beta Torvin, was a shadow given purpose. Grief and bitterness had festered in his heart, transforming him from a dissolute youth into a single-minded instrument of vengeance. He blamed not just Theron for his father's death, but the woman he saw as the catalyst, the Omega who had bewitched a king. He knew the fortress's rhythms, the blind spots and the guard rotations learned from a childhood spent within these very walls. Dressed in the stolen livery of a kitchen servant, he slipped through the post-celebration chaos, his movements silent and sure. His target was not the heavily guarded king. It was the heart of the king's weakness. It was the library. Elara was there, as she often was in the evenings, seeking a moment of quiet after the day's demands. She was tracing the illuminated script of an old history, her back to the door, bathed in the soft glow of a single oil lamp. The whisper of the door opening made her turn. She expected a servant, or perhaps Theron coming to fetch her. The sight of Jax, his face contorted with hate, a wickedly curved dagger in his hand, sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. This is for my father, he spat, advancing quickly. For a heart-stopping second, Elara was frozen, the terrified Omega from the ballroom resurfacing. But the feeling lasted only a moment. It was burned away by the memory of the circlet on her brow, the feel of Theron's love, the respect she had earned in the council room. She was the Luna of the Onyx Fortress. She did not scream. She did not cower. She took a step back, her hand closing around the heavy, metal-based oil lamp. You are a fool, Jax, she said, her voice low and steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Your father died by his own treachery, not by my hand. Do not throw your life away on a dead man's pride. He lunged. Elara reacted on instinct, swinging the lamp. It connected with his wrist with a sickening crack. He cried out, the dagger clattering to the stone floor. But he was bigger, stronger. He backhanded her across the face, the blow sending her stumbling back against the bookshelves, stars exploding in her vision. He loomed over her, his good hand reaching for her throat. I'll send him your heart. A roar of pure, undiluted fury shook the very foundations of the library. Theron stood in the doorway, not as a king, but as an avenging god. His power exploded outwards, a shockwave of rage that made the flames in the sconce's gutter and the ancient books tremble on their shelves. He had felt her spike of fear through their bond, a searing pain in his own soul. He crossed the distance in a blur. He didn't bother with the dagger on the floor. His hands, the same hands that had held Elara with such tenderness hours before, became weapons. He grabbed Jax by the throat and slammed him into the nearest stone column with a force that cracked the marble. The only heart that will be sent anywhere, Theron growled, his voice the sound of grinding boulders, is yours, in a box to whatever hell spawned your wretched family. Elara, clutching her throbbing cheek, pushed herself upright. Theron, wait, but it was too late. There was a final, sickening crunch. Theron dropped the lifeless body of Jax to the floor, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a feral light. He turned to Elara, his gaze frantic as he scanned her for injuries. When he saw the red mark on her face, a fresh wave of rage washed over him. He was at her side in an instant, his hands, now gentle, framing her face. He touched you. The words were a lethal whisper. He did, Elara said, her own voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. But I am all right. You came. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she didn't care. She could feel the violent tremor that ran through his powerful frame. It wasn't just anger, it was the terror of almost losing her. The shadows are gone now, Elara, he whispered into her hair, his voice raw. They are all gone. It is over. As the guards rushed in to clean up the aftermath, Theron swept his Luna into his arms and carried her from the library. The last thread of the past had been severed, not with a political decree, but with the brutal, final justice of the Alpha King. And in its place, a future, bright and unshadowed, awaited them. The official story was one of a tragic accident, a fall from a balcony while in a grief-stricken stupor. But in a castle of wolves, the truth had a scent, and the scent of blood and fury that had permeated the library that night was unmistakable. The news of Jax's fate spread through the Onyx Fortress not as a rumor, but as a cold, hard fact. The reaction was not uniform. For many, it was the final, necessary exclamation point on Theron's reign. The last ember of the Torvin rebellion had been decisively snuffed out. The king's power was absolute, his protection of his Luna, ferocious and complete. Respect for Elara grew, tinged now with a layer of awe. She had not only survived an assassination attempt, but she had faced her attacker with a courage that belied her Omega origins. But in the deepest shadows, where ambition and resentment festered, a new kind of whisper began. It was more subtle, more dangerous than the open grumblings of before. It did not question Elara's courage, but her influence. The king is unhinged when it comes to her, muttered Lord Valerius, a cousin twice removed from the royal line, over a glass of fortified wine in his private chambers. Did you see his eyes? It wasn't justice. It was a frenzy. She makes him volatile. A king ruled by passion is a weak king. Another, Lady Seraphine, who had once hoped to see her own daughter on the throne, nodded grimly. He thinks with his heart, not his head, where she is concerned. What happens when a decision for the good of the pack conflicts with her safety? Who will he choose? The criticism was insidious because it contained a grain of truth. Theron's love for Elara was his greatest strength and, in the eyes of some, his most vulnerable flaw. They began to watch her more closely, not as a novelty, but as a potential liability. Every suggestion she made in council was scrutinized for signs of softness. Every moment she spent with Theron was seen as a distraction from his duties. Elara felt the shift. She saw the calculating looks in the eyes of certain nobles, the overly polite deference that masked a deep-seated skepticism. It was a different kind of battle, one fought with whispers and sidelong glances, and it was in many ways more exhausting than facing a dagger. She confided in Theron one night as they prepared for bed. "They think you're weak because of me," she whispered, her back to him as she brushed her hair. His reflection in the mirror met hers. His expression was hard. Let them think what they want. But Theron, he turned her around to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me. My strength was never in my indifference. It was in my judgment. And my judgment tells me that you are the best thing to ever happen to me or this kingdom. You make me not weaker, but wiser. You give me a reason to build a legacy worth leaving, not just a kingdom to rule through fear." He kissed her forehead. "Their whispers are the death rattle of an old way of thinking. Ignore them." But Elara couldn't, because she knew that a king, no matter how powerful, could not rule alone. He needed the loyalty of his packs. And she was determined to earn it, not just for herself, but for him. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A strange, wasting sickness began to spread through the lower town, a fever that left the strong weak and the weak dying. The healers were baffled. It was not a plague they recognized. Panic began to simmer, and with it, the old whispers grew louder. Some even dared to suggest it was a curse, a blight brought upon them by the usurper Luna. Theron's response was swift and practical. Quarantine, clean water, and the mobilization of every able body to tend to the sick. But the morale was low, and fear was a contagion more virulent than any fever. Elara spent days in the healing wards, not as a figurehead, but as a pair of hands. She changed sweat-soaked linens, spooned broth into listless mouths, and held the hands of the dying. It was there, listening to the ramblings of a feverish child, that she heard it. The pretty red flower. By the creek, it tasted sweet. A red flower. Her mind, sharpened by hours spent in the royal library, made a connection. She rushed back, ignoring the exhaustion weighing down her limbs, and pulled a dusty botanical compendium from the shelves. There it was. The fanged bloom. A rare, invasive plant whose pollen, when ingested, caused a fever that mimicked illness, leading to paralysis and death. It had not been seen in the region for a century. She didn't go to the council. She went directly to Theron, the book in her hand. "It's not a sickness. It's a poison. The fanged bloom. It's growing in the streams that feed the lower town's wells." Theron immediately dispatched a team of rangers. They returned with samples of the vicious-looking red flower, its roots indeed fouling the water source. The cure, detailed in the same book, was a simple antidote made from common elderberry and willow bark. The response was mobilized in hours. The antidote was distributed, the water sources were cleared, and the plague was stopped in its tracks. The effect on the pack was transformative. The nobles who had whispered saw the Luna not as a distraction, but as a savior. She had used her knowledge, her quiet perseverance, to do what their strongest warriors and most experienced healers could not. She had saved their children, their parents, their mates. Lord Valerius himself approached her in the great hall, his head bowed lower than it had ever been. The pack owes you a great debt, Luna. Forgive an old wolf his outdated notions. Elara simply nodded, her gaze steady. There is nothing to forgive, Lord Valerius. We protect our own. That is all that matters. That night, as Theron held her close, his body curled around hers in their large bed, he nuzzled her hair. You see, he murmured, his voice thick with pride and love. You are not my weakness. You are this kingdom's greatest strength. The trial of the fanged BL. Had silenced the whispers, not with force, but with proof. The Luna had earned her place not just in the king's bed, but in the heart of the pack. The threat, when it came, was not from within, but from beyond their borders. A messenger, dust-covered and bleeding from a dozen minor wounds, collapsed in the courtyard. He carried a sealed scroll from the Alpha of the neighboring Sunrock pack. The message was blunt. Karn, the Sunrock Alpha, demanded tribute, a significant portion of the Onyx Fortress's winter stores and mining rights to the northern silver veins. His justification was a fabricated claim of border incursions. It was a naked power grab, fueled by the belief that Theron, softened by his new mate, would be unwilling to go to war. The War Council was a storm of conflicting opinions. The older commanders, Rorik among them, advocated for immediate, overwhelming force. Show Karn the sharp end of our spears. He'll remember his place. The younger, more cautious voices worried about the cost of a winter war, the lives that would be lost. Theron listened, his face a mask of granite. He then turned to Elara, who had been silent, studying the map. Luna, your counsel. All eyes turned to her. This was not a matter of logistics or healing. This was the brink of war. Elara stood, her finger tracing the border on the map. Karn is a bully, not a fool. He attacks now because he believes we are divided and our king is distracted. Sending our army to the border is exactly what he expects. It would be costly, and it would leave other parts of our territory vulnerable. She looked at Theron. He needs to be reminded of your strength, but on our terms. What do you propose? Theron asked, his interest piqued. A summit, she said. Here, at the Onyx Fortress. Invite him and his entire war council. Let him come into your domain. Let him see that we are not divided, but united. Let him feel the strength of our walls and the loyalty of our people. Let him sit across from you and explain his lies to your face. A daring, brilliant gamble. Instead of meeting him on the field, she proposed to bring the enemy into their home, to fight the battle with psychology and power instead of claws and fangs. Theron's eyes gleamed with a fierce, proud light. Do it, he commanded. Send the invitations. The week of the summit arrived. The Onyx Fortress was polished to a terrifying gleam. Every guard stood at rigid attention. The people, their loyalty forged by the recent trials, lined the streets, their silence more intimidating than any roar. Karn and his entourage arrived, their swagger fading as they passed through the mighty gates and felt the weight of the fortress's might and the united, cold gaze of its inhabitants. The feast that night was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Opulent but restrained, showcasing wealth without indulgence, power without bluster. When Karn, his confidence visibly shaken, tried to reiterate his demands the next day in the throne room, his words sounded hollow and foolish even to his own men. He was not addressing a weakened king. He was facing a united front, a king and queen whose bond seemed to be a source of immeasurable strength. Theron didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply dismantled Karn's arguments with cold, irrefutable logic, while Elara sat beside him, her serene presence a silent testament to the stability of his reign. In the end, Karn left with nothing but a formal warning and the humiliating knowledge that his gamble had failed spectacularly. The war had been won without a single drop of blood being spilled. As Karn's party retreated from the gates, Theron pulled Elara into his arms right there on the battlements, in full view of the cheering pack. You, he said, his voice full of awe, are a queen among queens. The Howling Summit had not just averted a war, it had cemented the legend of the king and his Luna, proving that their combined strength was a force more formidable than any army. The victory of the Howling Summit settled like a warm, golden light over the Onyx Fortress. The pack's unity was stronger than ever, their faith in their rulers unshakable. In the weeks that followed, a new, different kind of energy began to thrum through the castle, a sense of peace, of deep-rooted contentment that even the most cynical courtiers could not ignore. For Elara, the change was both subtle and profound. It began with a lingering fatigue that a good night's sleep couldn't cure. Then came the strange, metallic taste in her mouth each morning, and a sudden, overwhelming aversion to the smell of roasting meat that had once been her favorite. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to the stress of the recent events. But when she nearly fainted during a morning council session, Theron's concern became a palpable, frantic thing. He dismissed the council with a wave of his hand, his attention solely on her. "Enough," he said, his voice tight as he helped her to their chambers. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." The healer, now, the fortress's head healer, an ancient, sharp-eyed woman named Anya, was summoned. She examined Elara with a practiced, gentle touch, her wrinkled hands pausing over Elara's abdomen. A long, silent moment passed, Anya's eyes closed in concentration. When they opened, they were shining with a knowing light. She turned to Theron, who was pacing like a caged wolf, his anxiety a storm in the room. "Your Majesty," Anya said, a slow, reverent smile spreading across her face. "The Luna is not ill. She is with chill. The moon goddess has blessed your union." The words hung in the air, seeming to still the very dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Theron stopped his pacing as if he'd run into a wall. All the color drained from his face, then rushed back in a flood. He looked from Anya to Elara, his silver eyes wide, his powerful frame seeming to tremble. "A child?" He breathed, the word a fragile, hopeful thing. Elara's own hand flew to her stomach, tears welling in her eyes. A baby. Their baby. The final, miraculous seal on their bond. The lonely Omega who had nothing was now a queen, a mate, and soon, a mother. Theron crossed the room in 2 strides, sinking to his knees before her chair. He didn't speak, he simply laid his head in her lap, his arms wrapping around her waist, his shoulders shaking with a silent, overwhelming emotion. She cradled his head, her fingers threading through his dark hair, her own tears falling freely. When he finally looked up, his eyes were blazing with a love so fierce it stole her breath. "A pup," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. "Our pup." He pressed a fervent, worshipful kiss to her stomach, a promise and a pledge to the life growing within her. The news spread through the fortress like wildfire, and the reaction was a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. The pack, whose future had once seemed uncertain, now had a tangible symbol of hope, of continuity. The coming child was not just an heir, it was a living testament to the love that had saved and strengthened the kingdom. Theron became a different man. The fierce, often terrifying Alpha King was suddenly, endearingly clumsy with worry. He fretted over her rest, her diet, the temperature of her bathwater. He would often just sit and watch her, his hand resting on her still flat stomach, a look of bewildered joy on his face. In the quiet of their chambers, he would talk to the baby, his voice a low, rumbling murmur against her skin. "You are the most wanted, most loved pup in all the world," he would say. "You have the bravest mother, and I will spend my life making sure you both know only happiness." The shadow of the past was gone, burned away by the brilliant, dawning light of their future. The Onyx Fortress was no longer just a stronghold of power, it had become a home, waiting to be filled with the sound of a child's laughter. As Elara's pregnancy progressed, a new, insidious threat began to coil its way through the kingdom, a ghost from the ashes of the old rebellion. It did not come with drawn steel or shouted challenges, but with whispered words and carefully planted doubts. The source was Lyra, a distant cousin of the executed Beta Torvin. She was a woman of sharp beauty and sharper cunning, who had always harbored a deep-seated resentment for Theron and for the Omega who had taken the place she felt should have been hers. She had survived the purges by virtue of her perceived insignificance, but now, seeing the kingdom united and joyful behind their pregnant Luna, her bitterness festered into a venomous plot. She began to weave a tapestry of lies, subtle and cruel. In the market, she would sigh to other nobles, "The child is a blessing, of course." But one wonders. The Luna was so suddenly ill, and the pregnancy announced so soon after the summit. A convenient way to cement her position, don't you think? To others, she would murmur, "The king is blinded by his love." He doesn't see what others do. The child's timing is fortunate. Almost too fortunate. The whispers were designed to plant a seed of doubt about the child's paternity, to suggest that Elara had orchestrated the pregnancy to secure her power. It was the most damaging accusation that could be leveled against a queen, striking at the very legitimacy of the heir and the honor of the king. At first, the loyal pack dismissed it. But lies, when repeated often enough, can find purchase in even the most faithful minds. The joy surrounding the pregnancy became tinged with a subtle, unspoken tension. Elara felt it in the lingering stares, in the conversations that hushed when she entered a room. Theron, fiercely protective and attuned to every shift in her mood, sensed her distress. "What is it?" he asked one evening, his hand resting on the now distinct curve of her belly. "You are troubled." She tried to dismiss it, not wanting to burden him, but he saw through her facade. Finally, she told him of the whispers she had overheard, the insinuations of Lyra and her followers. A cold, terrifying stillness came over Theron. The loving father-to-be vanished, and the Alpha King, the one who had broken necks with his bare hands, returned. His eyes turned to chips of ice. "I will have her head for this," he vowed, his voice deathly quiet. "No," Elara said, placing a hand on his arm. "Execution will only make her a martyr and give credence to her lies. This is a battle of truth, Theron, not force." She knew she had to face this shadow not from behind the shield of the king's power, but with the strength of her own truth. She devised a plan, one that required patience and a deep, unshakable faith in their bond. Elara did not hide from the rumors. Instead, she leaned into her role as Luna. She walked among the people more than ever, her growing belly a visible testament to the life she carried. She spoke openly of her joy, of her love for Theron, and of her hopes for their child. Her serenity in the face of the vicious gossip began to turn the tide of public opinion. Her courage was a quiet rebuke to the whispers. Meanwhile, Theron, following her counsel, gave Lyra enough rope to hang herself. He allowed her faction to grow confident, to believe their lies were taking root. Kale, the spymaster, infiltrated her inner circle, gathering evidence of her conspiracy. The culmination came during the celebration of the winter solstice. The entire pack was gathered in the Great Hall. Elara, radiant in a gown of deep emerald that highlighted her pregnancy, stood beside Theron. As the festivities reached their peak, Lyra, emboldened by wine and a misplaced sense of victory, stood and raised her glass. "A toast," she called out, her voice slicing through the merriment. "To the future heir, may the child grow strong and true, a worthy successor to his illustrious father." The pause was deliberate, the insinuation clear. The hall fell into a stunned, horrified silence. All eyes flew to the dais. Theron began to rise, his face a mask of murderous rage, but Elara's hand on his arm stopped him. She stepped forward, her posture regal and unafraid. "Thank you for your thoughtful toast, Lady Lyra," Elara said, her voice carrying effortlessly. "The future of this pack is indeed a matter of great importance. Which is why it is so vital that its leadership is built on a foundation of truth, not poisoned lies." She turned her gaze to the entire assembly. "I have heard the whispers. I know what some of you are thinking. You look at my child and you see a question, not a blessing." Her hand rested on her stomach. "So, let us end this here and now. Let there be no shadow of a doubt." She nodded to Anya, the healer, who stepped forward. "As the head healer, I can attest to the timeline of the Luna's pregnancy," Anya declared loudly. "It aligns perfectly with the Luna's cycles and the king's presence in the fortress. The conception occurred weeks before the Sunrock summit. The child is, without question, the true-born heir of Alpha King Theron." Then, Elara did something that shocked the entire court. She looked directly at Lyra, her gray eyes like chips of flint. "You have sought to undermine your king and your Luna with cowardly lies. You have attacked an unborn child. You have no honor." She then turned to Theron. "My king, the law states that for a challenge against a royal's honor, the accused may demand a trial of truth. I demand it now. Let the moon goddess herself judge between Lyra's lies and my truth." A trial of truth was an ancient, rarely invoked ritual. The accuser and accused would each swear an oath under the light of the full moon, their hands on the sacred pack stone. It was believed that the goddess would strike down the one who spoke falsely. Lyra's face went white with terror. She had not expected this. She had thought to fight with whispers, not in the stark, unforgiving Lig. "HT of divine judgment. I withdraw my toast," she stammered. It was a poor jest. Your jest was treason. Theron's voice cut through her panic like a blade. The Luna has invoked the trial. You will participate, or you will be found guilty by your own cowardice. Under the cold, brilliant light of the full moon, the entire pack gathered in the circle of truth. Elara, her back straight, placed her hand on the cold, rune-covered stone. I, Elara, Luna of the Onyx Fortress, swear that the child I carry is the true-born son of Alpha King Theron, conceived in love and fidelity. So may the moon goddess witness my words. She stepped back, unharmed. Trembling violently, Lyra was forced forward. She placed a shaking hand on the stone. I swear that I spoke only what I believed to be true, she began, hedging her words. A collective gasp went up. She had not even finished her oath before a sudden, violent wind extinguished all the torches, plunging the circle into an eerie darkness lit only by the moon. When the torches were relit, Lyra was on her knees, weeping, exposed as a liar before the entire pack and their goddess. Theron didn't need to order her execution. Her own words, and the divine judgment that followed, had destroyed her. She and her co-conspirators were stripped of their titles and banished forever, their names becoming synonymous with treachery. Elara had faced the shadow not with claws, but with unwavering truth and courage. As Theron led her back to the fortress, his arm around her, the pack's cheers were not just for their Luna, but for the mother of their future, who had proven that the greatest strength of their kingdom was the integrity of its heart. The final weeks of Elara's pregnancy were a study in controlled anticipation. The fortress, purged of Lyra's poison, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, its energy turning inwards, towards the nurturing of the future. Theron was a constant, vigilant presence, his earlier clumsy worry having evolved into a steadfast, calming strength. He attended every healer's appointment with Elara, his large hand never far from hers, his deep voice a steady rumble as he asked Anya endless, detailed questions. The royal chambers were prepared. A bassinet of polished dark wood, carved with running wolves and crescent moons, stood ready beside their bed. Tiny garments of the softest linen and warmest furs were folded in waiting. The air itself seemed to hum with a soft, magical expectancy. The first contraction came on a night when the northern lights painted the sky in shifting veils of emerald and violet. Elara was sitting by the fire, her hand resting on the frantic, rolling movements of her son, when a deep, tightening ache bloomed in her back and wrapped around her abdomen. She let out a soft gasp. Theron was at her side in an instant, his book forgotten. Elara, it's time, she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The fortress, which had been settling into its nightly quiet, erupted into silent, efficient activity. Anya and her team of midwives took command of the royal chambers. Theron, against all tradition which demanded the alpha wait elsewhere, refused to leave Elara's side. He dismissed the protests with a single, sharp look, his place determined not by custom, but by bond. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and pressure for Elara, a trial of endurance that eclipsed any physical challenge she had ever faced. But through it all, Theron was her anchor. He held her hand, letting her crush his fingers without a flinch. He mopped her brow with a cool cloth, whispering words of encouragement and love into her ear, his voice a lifeline in the storm of sensation. You are so strong, my love. My brave, beautiful Luna. Almost there. I can see him. Our son. I am here. I have you. Always. When the final, searing push came, and the indignant, healthy cry of their child filled the room, the world seemed to stop. Tears streamed down Theron's face as he watched Anya lift their squirming, perfect son and place him on Elara's chest. He was beautiful. A shock of dark hair, so like Theron's, and when his eyes, a startling, familiar mercury silver, blinked open, a sob caught in Elara's throat. He was the living image of his father. Theron knelt beside the bed, his gaze locked on the tiny, miraculous being in his mate's arms. He reached out a trembling finger, and their son's tiny hand wrapped around it with a surprising strength. Our son, Theron breathed, the words filled with more awe than any title he had ever held. He looked at Elara, his heart in his silver eyes. You have given me everything. They named him Kaelin, a strong, ancient name meaning, eternal warrior. The news was announced to the pack, and the cheers that rose from the fortress and the town below were thunderous, a wave of genuine joy that shook the very stones of the mountain. In the days that followed, Theron was transformed. The fierce Alpha King was often found simply staring at his sleeping son, a look of such profound, tender wonder on his face that it brought tears to the eyes of the servants. He learned to change diapers with a general's focus, and his deep, rumbling voice could often be heard singing old, gentle lullabies to the baby, his usual commanding tones softened to a whisper. Elara, watching her mate with their child, felt a love so vast and complete it was almost painful. The lonely Omega was now the center of a universe, a queen, a mate, a mother. The circle of their little family. Lee was now complete, the final, perfect piece of their happiness. A year passed in a blissful, swift-flowing stream. Kaelin grew from a tiny, mewling bundle into a bright-eyed, curious toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's storm-gray eyes, though they now held a distinct silver ring around the iris, a promise of the power he would one day inherit. His first steps were taken in the great hall, stumbling gleefully into his father's waiting arms, to the delighted laughter of the court. The kingdom flourished. The policies of fairness and compassion that Elara had championed had borne rich fruit. The Packs were united, their loyalty to the royal family absolute. The Onyx Fortress was no longer just a symbol of intimidating power, but a beacon of stability and prosperity. On the anniversary of their coronation, a grand celebration was held. The hall was once again filled with light and music, but the atmosphere was entirely different from the tense night Elara had first walked into it. This was a celebration of peace, of family, of a future secure. As the festivities wound down, Theron took Elara's hand and led her, with a sleeping Kaelin cradled in his other arm, to their favorite spot, the high balcony overlooking the kingdom. The twin moons were full, bathing the world below in a soft, ethereal light. Below them, the lights of the town twinkled like fallen stars. The sounds of laughter and music drifted up on the cool night air. It was a kingdom at peace, a kingdom they had built together. Theron stood behind Elara, his arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on her head. Kaelin slept soundly against his chest. "Do you remember," Theron murmured, his voice a soft vibration against her, "the night you sat on my lap? So brave and so terrified." Elara leaned back into his solid strength, a soft smile on her lips. "I remember thinking I was jumping from a cliff." "You were," he said, his arms tightening around her. "And you pulled me with you. It was the best fall of my life." They were silent for a while, watching their kingdom sleep. "The girl who was sold for a political alliance," Theron whispered, his lips brushing her hair. "Now the queen who rules the most powerful kingdom in the land. The mother of its future." Elara turned in his arms, looking up at him, her love for him shining brightly in her eyes. "And the prince who followed his heart," she said, reaching up to touch his face, "found a kingdom, and a love, worthier than any throne." He kissed her then, under the light of the twin moons, with their son sleeping peacefully between them. It was a kiss of deep, abiding love, of shared triumph, of a bond that had been tested by fire and ice and had emerged unbreakable. Their story had begun with a desperate gamble and a whispered promise. It had woven through betrayal and vengeance, through political intrigue and the quiet power of truth. It had been blessed with new life. And as they stood together, a family, a dynasty, watching over the kingdom they had built with love and strength, they knew that this was not an ending. It was a legacy. A legacy of moon and shadow, of heart and claw, that would echo through the ages. Their happy ending was, in truth, a beautiful, everlasting beginning.